Hello, everyone. My name is Milani Fraser, and I'm the Manager of Advanced Analysis here at FireEye Threat Intelligence. With me today, I have Jacqueline O'Leary. She's a Senior Analyst on our team, as well as Christopher DiGiamo. He's a Principal Security Architect here at Mandiant. Just a little bit before we start today, I'd like to talk about what my team does. So we do deep dive analysis, which means we look across all FireEye data, including data from FireEye appliances, data from Mandiant forensic response engagements, as well as our internal repositories and open source intelligence. So today, we would like to unveil results of research that we've been doing for months and introduce to you a new threat group, which we are calling APT 38.
And our talk is going to build on our blog, which came out today, and white paper, which is available on the FireEye website. So our agenda for today. We're going to start out by talking about APT 38's targeting. Then we're going to move into our assessment of APT 38 in comparison to some other publicly identified North Korean groups. Then we'll move into their evolution of operations, so how we think the group has changed over time based on our visibility. Then we'll move into the anatomy of the attack, which is the attack lifecycle specific to APT 38. Then we'll talk about Tradecraft a little bit, the scope and scale, the resources we believe that are associated with the operation. Then we'll end with motivations, and finally attribution, why we believe this is a nation-state threat.
So who is APT 38? APT 38 is a financially motivated group that has been linked to North Korean cyber operations. They have been responsible for some of the biggest cyber heists, stealing millions of dollars from financial institutions and causing networks to be inoperable. Their mission is to target financial institutions in order to raise money for the regime. And this is really important because this is the first time that we've seen a cybercrime group essentially funding a regime. Since 2015, we've seen APT 38 steal approximately $1.1 billion. Attempt to steal, sorry.
Important distinction.
Right. They've stolen hundreds of millions of dollars, but they've attempted to steal 1.1 billion. So in terms of the organizations that they have compromised, it's been very geographically diverse. So they have compromised at least 16 organizations in at least 11 different countries. And since 2015, they have compromised or conducted at least 5 public bank heists. And these are only the ones that we know about that have been public, right? So due to the sensitivity of these kinds of actual compromises, there are likely to be more. So in terms of where they have targeted organizations, it's been very geographically diverse. So they have targeted organizations in Latin America, in Europe, in the US, and elsewhere.
So in regards to their industry targeting, we have seen APT 38 primarily target banks and other financials. We also believe that APT 38 pursues what we call to be secondary targets, and these include entities like media, cryptocurrency entities, and government. And we believe that these are targeted based on their proximity to banks. So for example, we saw a news outlet's website that was compromised, but they predominantly cover, business and financial news that we assess would be of interest to banks and other financial institutions. Similar to the cryptocurrency entity, we saw their website compromised around the time of an initial coin offering. So we assessed that there was substantial traffic from financial institutions to those websites.
So really this all started with a reevaluation of activity linked to North Korea, right? So some of you may be aware of the term Lazarus. That one has been publicly reported. The term Lazarus started around 2014 when analysts were trying to get a better picture of the tools and infrastructure related to the destructive attack on a really popular entertainment company. Over time, though, the tools and the infrastructure, and specifically the motivations associated with some of that activity diverged, right? So we decided to take out some of that financial motivated activity and the targeting of banks in particular, and separate that into what we're calling APT 38.
So it's really APT 38's long-standing commitment to targeting financial entities that really drove our decision to separate it from other North Korean groups, specifically Temp Permit, which is a group that we've previously reported on. So when we're looking at the differences between APT 38 and Temp Permit, two main differences come to mind. So as we've discussed, APT 38 has conducted mostly financial targeting and on a global scale. In comparison, Temp Permit has usually targeted government and defense entities, usually clustered around South Korea and the United States. We also think that tools and techniques and some intended outcomes differ between the groups. So for example, we think APT 38's toolset is much more specialized. It shows a deep study of the systems that they're specifically targeting. In the case of APT 38, that's SWIFT systems, whereas Temp Permit's tools are much more general and non-specific to the systems they're actually targeting.
So recently, earlier this month, the US Department of Justice released a complaint. The complaint was targeted against a North Korean national, Park Jin-hook, and it talked about North Korean cyber operations. This complaint was 179 pages, and it took us a little time to digest. So really one of the most interesting things about this complaint is it really talked about the social media accounts that was used in targeting. It talked about the infrastructure that was used. It talked about the developers. It really gave us kind of a big overview of North Korean cyber operations and of targeting of the entertainment industry as well as financial and defense industries.
Some interesting overlaps that we saw discussed in the complaint were social media accounts that were used across targets. So used to target an entertainment entity, defense entities, and then also some targets we associate with APT 38. And while those overlaps are interesting, we know a couple of things. We know that these accounts were likely reused by different operators. And based on the vast number of compromises that we know are associated with APT 38, we think that the skill set associated with reconnaissance and phishing is likely different from post-compromise actions. And therefore, we believe that those job functions could also be separate. So just to summarize some of the information we've discussed, the subject of the complaint, Park Jin-hook, we believe that he contributed to multiple North Korean operations differentiated by motivation. So we've talked about a couple of these: espionage, financially motivated actions, and also some disruptive. Despite these malware development resource overlaps between APT 38 and Temp Permit, we assess that those groups are separate and distinct from one another, and also separate and distinct from the larger Lazarus kind of umbrella group that has dominated the discussion of North Korean cyber operations in recent years. So it's our unique visibility into this group for a number of years that really allows us to see how they have changed over time. So we first identified APT 38 activity in 2014. And what was going on at this time was kind of interesting. They were targeting banks, but they weren't doing things like attempting fraudulent transactions or sometimes even targeting SWIFT systems. What was even more interesting was they were using some of the same tools, though, that we would see in later compromises. So what we can assess from this is that these were, reconnaissance operations. They were starting out, they were trying to learn as much as they could about banks and the systems and kind of how the functionality worked. A short while later, not too long, in December 2015, we saw APT 38's targeting escalate, and they attempted, fraudulent transactions for the first time.
Then in October 2016 through February 2017, we saw APT 38 compromise several legitimate websites in order to compromise victims who visited those websites.
So one of the most interesting things that has come out of our study of this group is that despite the really public events and public nature of these heists and the bold nature of these operations, we've really determined that APT 38 operations were really not a smash and grab situation. And so what I mean by that is their main objective was not to gain access to an entity as quickly as possible, move to SWIFT quickly and transfer that money and get out of there. They really wanted to study the environment around them. And I think one statistic that really speaks to that is that of all the compromises we've looked at, on average, APT 38 threat actors spent 155 days in a compromised environment. And in certain instances, they were in there for even longer. One of the longest durations, they were there for 678 days, so almost 2 years. Why is this important? Well, it tells us that APT 38 can balance multiple motivations. So they're obviously financially motivated, but at the same time, they operate like a traditional espionage operation, and they really want to learn as much as they can about an environment, before attempting those transactions. Another thing that's particularly interesting is the varying lengths of time in the environment, even specific to the SWIFT system. So in certain instances, we would see them compromise an entity, gain access to the SWIFT system, and then, within a month or so, they would conduct those fraudulent transactions. But then in other instances, they'd gain access to SWIFT and they'd wait, sometimes 2 years before attempting those transactions. So now we're going to go over the anatomy of attack for APT 38. So this is kind of the bread and butter, their main mission when they get into an environment, and the steps that they use. So these 6 steps are initial reconnaissance, or initial gathering, initial compromise, reconnaissance, pivot to SWIFT servers, transfer funds, and then destroy evidence. So this first step, information gathering. This is characterized by APT 38 trying to learn as much about, employees of the targeted organization as they can. And additionally, third-party entities that might have access to SWIFT. So one notable example of this is that we observed APT 38 try multiple times to gain access to the email account of an account manager at a bank. And we believe that they were looking to gain more information about other employees that might have access to SWIFT.
Then, in terms of initial compromise, so we've already talked about them compromising legitimate websites, right? So one example of that was they targeted the Polish Financial Authority, and that was likely to target organizations in Europe. Another example is we've seen them target Linux servers, and especially out-of-date versions of Apache struts.
So the third step is reconnaissance, and this goes back to what I mentioned before about learning as much as they can about the environment. So during this phase, they're gathering credentials, they're mapping network topology, they're scanning systems, they're trying to learn as much as they can. And some instances come to mind that illustrate how well APT 38 understood their environment. So in one instance, we actually saw them leverage a legitimate file transfer program that was already inherent on the host that they compromised, and they actually used it to transfer and delete malware. In another instance, we saw them incorporate a hard-coded proxy IP into their malware that was actually specific to the victim environment.
Then, once they had gotten a lay of the land, then they tried to pivot to the SWIFT servers. And we've seen them use both their own tools to do that, as well as using internal tools. So one example in particular was they used Sysmon to get an example of the users and the processes and the services that had access to the SWIFT servers. We've also seen them use both passive and active backdoors with the environment. And this is so they could tunnel through the environment and gain access to the internally segmented systems.
So the next step is, where the money's at, for lack of a better term. So transferring funds. So we would see them deploy DIPAC, which is their SWIFT hijacking framework, the malware that they would use to actually cause these fraudulent transactions. But what's interesting enough is that they would conduct these fraudulent transfers, but they'd also want to alter the transaction history so that personnel at the banks could not see these transactions. Some other characteristic elements during this time: they'd usually conduct multiple transfers, so incremental transfers, and they'd often send money to countries that had lax oversight when it came to money laundering.
And then finally, once they had accomplished their mission in terms of transferring their funds, then they proceed to burn down the house, right? So we've seen them delete logs. That's something that a lot of the APT groups do use. But we've seen them take that a step further in terms of destruction. So one of the things they did right before they burned down the house was they deployed distraction techniques. So one example in particular was they deployed ransomware. And in one case, they deployed Hermes, which actually wasn't set to collect ransom. Then, after they distracted the investigators, then they proceeded to wipe disks, right? So in one example, we saw APT 38 compromise the system and then burn down the house in terms of 10,000 workstations and servers were knocked offline, phone services went down, essential services went down, employees walked into blue screens at work. It's just chaos.
Okay, so now that we've gotten a better idea of how APT 38 operates, that sort of TTPs that we've gained from the attack lifecycle really kind of influence our characterization of these operators. And so our characterization kind of goes beyond what's in the headlines. You know, we obviously know these operators are bold, but what else have we learned about them? Well, as Nalani mentioned, we know that they're brazen. So, you know, they'll freely deploy disk wiping malware to selected systems to essentially burn down the house. Another instance of them being fairly brazen was that in certain cases, we actually observed them initiate an AV scan on a compromised host to see if their own malware would be detected. On the other hand, while they're brazen, they're also measured. So we've talked about this before. They would dedicate the amount of time necessary to learn as much as they could about the environment, and they really conducted thorough reconnaissance efforts. Finally, we think that they're agile, and this comes from our observations regarding their interactions with antivirus. So in one case, they deployed a blind toad loader to multiple systems, and it was quickly detected by AV. Well, they returned to the environment, uploaded a modified version of blind toad that wasn't detected. So it demonstrates that they were responsive quickly, and they would also modify malware to take into account, you know, developments that they were making, things that they had previously done manually, they incorporated into malware.
So now I kind of want to talk about APT 38's Tradecraft. So specifically, out of the entire world of all the different APT groups, and I've been working at Mandiant for about 6 years doing investigations almost specifically of APT groups, really what makes this group different than the other groups? So right, everybody's kind of familiar with APT 1, and maybe you remember APT 28 or 29 that we associate with the Russian government, and we kind of try to rank them, and especially when I'm going into an investigation, I kind of want to know, well, who do we think is there, and what are their capabilities? And one of the things that stands out about APT 38 is they look really, really different than the other groups. And so how do I put that into words? One of the things that looks different about them is that the tools that they use and the resources that they have available are obviously extremely well funded. So these guys have everything custom. They very rarely use open source techniques or open source tools to provide the work they do. And even in some of the silly stuff, like they have a tool called MapMaker that literally just runs netstat over and over again to see who's logging into a box. They made their own version of that, and it's like super well protected and packed with Thermita and other things that are like, why are you going to such effort for just this very simple functionality? What it says to me as an investigator is this group really understands their position, what they're trying to achieve, and they don't want to be detected. And if they are detected, they want to make sure that whoever detects them has the hardest time possible trying to respond to them. Specifically, the things of their tradecraft that we're going to focus on is their penchant for modular malware, their ability to kind of seamlessly compromise different operating systems, specifically all the things they do to make investigators like me lives miserable, which are very fun, and definitely I get to earn my salary. And then the destructive components, kind of the things that we really know about, really, those are the things you kind of hear about in the news. Hey, these guys, seem to have the ability to destroy stuff and get away with it, and a lot of other groups, I've been responding to APT threats for many years now. I haven't really worked on many environments where organizations or APT threat actors felt like they could just completely destroy a network and get away with it. But these guys don't really seem to care. And that makes responding to them very, very interesting. So one of the things I want to share first is specifically one of the malware families that they use called NESTEGG. This is a pretty popular one. I've seen it at, they've been using this since like 2015. And what's really interesting about it is it's literally like performing a scavenger hunt or an Easter egg hunt on the system to put all the pieces back together to figure out what this thing was doing in the first place. And the way that they do that is they use multiple different RC4 keys that decrypt different sections of their malware, and these pieces can be scattered either on the file system or in the registry or in other locations, sometimes embedded in other files. And you need to really put all these pieces back together to figure out what was this piece of malware doing, how is it configured, and specifically, like, what capabilities did it have in this specific version. And so as an investigator, this means I can't just go and find this bad.exe, take this file off and figure out what it's doing. I need to actually sit there and figure out where all the other pieces are that go into this, that recreate the full functionality of it. It also means that if you have antivirus software or some other security tool that's just looking for bad files, oftentimes they don't really understand that this thing is super modular and has multiple pieces to it and can't put those things back together. So it really does a good job of evading detection. Also, once they put this whole thing back together, it can actually operate in two extremely different ways. One way it operates is in a standard backdoor function, where it will just beacon out to the internet and do connections. And then the other way it'll operate is 100% passive. And that's what's really interesting is because in specifically just the passive version, that's the one that they put on the Swift servers and other really important systems. Essentially, they wanted backdoor access to these systems, but they didn't want these systems connecting to the internet or doing weird stuff or trying to resolve suspicious domain names. So they really put it in kind of hidden mode, and you could only connect to it from another NESTEGG backdoor in the environment. So, willing to let the workstations be detected with infections, really not willing to let the servers be detected. One other really interesting thing they did with this backdoor was they put a date in there. And if the backdoor configuration hadn't been updated by that date, it would remove itself from the system. And so they're basically saying, hey, we want to put malware here, but for whatever reason, say we lose access to this environment, say we're working on 5 other breaches or 5 other operations at the same time, and we don't have a chance to go in and re-update our backdoor and maybe change its functionality. I want this thing to kill itself so that no one has a chance to find it. In addition to kind of their normal tradecraft, and just one of the things that we see a lot of specific APT actors do is they're really usually familiar with some environments, and oftentimes a lot of the groups that we track are very Windows focused. They get on a system, they get domain admin, then they can basically just connect to everything. And then if an environment maybe has like a couple systems that are Linux or Unix or Mac or something like that, they might try to put some effort into targeting them, or just try to get those systems or their system's data through something like a share or some other interactive service. But what we've seen this group do is specifically go into the environment, target open Linux systems or anything they might have, infect those systems, and then from those systems specifically place and stage tools that are Linux compiled Windows utilities for breaking into Windows systems. So essentially they're leveraging any kind of system in the environment, and we'll load up cross-operating system tools on there to break in and get into other sections of the network. And then we usually see them then load additional tools and additional tunnelers to then break into other systems. In one previous case we worked on, the attacker not only wanted to destroy the Windows environment, but they wanted to destroy the Linux environment and Unix environment too. So they actually spent like a couple months figuring out all the different admin and root account and different things for the database systems and the other systems, and compiling that into a list so that they could spray not only all their Windows systems offline through Active Directory, but all their Linux systems offline through SSH scripts. And then, the part that I hate the most as an investigator is they seem to really not want their tools to be identified and ripped off these systems. So, this kind of bums me out, obviously, because I want to see what the heck they're doing. And oftentimes, I'm trying to figure out what they're doing after they've destroyed an environment. So first things first, once these attackers destroy an environment, pretty much no tools collect the data by default. If you try to put a device destroyed by one of APT 38's backdoors or wipers into Encase. Encase just goes, I don't know what the heck I'm looking at. So they're destroying very specific portions of the hard drive that essentially most tools rely on that are sometimes hard drive specific or operating system specific, and it's really hard for us to recover that information. Another technique they use is memory-only plugins. So when they want to do something malicious, they only send it and stage it in memory for a short amount of time. So actually, in the most recent Swift investigation I performed, the actual Swift malware was never on the disk at any one point. It actually was only there for probably the 3 hours they actually performed the Swift hijack, and then they killed that process. And you can trust me, I looked at every freaking part of that 200 gigabyte hard drive. I could not find it anywhere on there. So it wasn't on there. They also use things like just-in-time backdoors they put on, use really fast, delete. If you weren't there, if you didn't capture that traffic, if you didn't capture that file when it was placed on there, you're not getting that backdoor, you're not figuring out those communications. And they even make specific cleaners for their backdoors that they schedule on the system. So they'll actually say, here's my backdoor, and maybe it puts all of these little Easter eggs everywhere. I make the second tool that specifically knows the location of all those Easter eggs and runs through and cleans them up automatically and then deletes itself. So the fact that they're going to the effort to write an own anti-backdoor program for their backdoor to remove their backdoor is something I really don't appreciate. And on top of that, when they're deleting their files, they're not just deleting them on the operating system, like pressing delete, recycle bin, clear, or whatever. The way that Windows deletes files, it doesn't actually delete the contents of the files. It just kind of leaves it on the hard drive somewhere in a place you can't figure it out. But forensic experts, we know how to find those files. They actually go directly on the hard drive level with a raw read disk and actually go in there and modify the bytes directly on the hard drive. So even if you can recover that file, you're recovering a whole bunch of gibberish. So, and then, the thing that you guys probably are super fascinated about, or maybe the thing you hear the most about, is they have a whole bunch of tools for destroying hard drives. Like, not just one thing, it's not just one implementation. It's not like, yeah, we got this proof of concept of how to destroy stuff. It's like, we got this proof of concept, and we're making it better and releasing new versions of it, and screwing up more stuff on the hard drive. And honestly speaking, it works really well. The times that we're successful is that this wiper actually destroys the hard drive before the wiper can keep running, and so it destroyed something really important, and then the system shuts down and didn't actually have time to wipe everything. We saw them use TinyFuse. Other North Korean threat actors used TinyFuse a while ago in some breaches, and that was they were using just a repackaged legitimate tool for writing files on the hard drive directly, and obviously using it to write gibberish on the hard drive. We talked about Hermes, a fake ransomware, just used to destroy stuff, encrypt all your files, and then basically render your system inoperable. More recently, they've been using bootrec a lot, and that one's really fascinating because, again, it destroys not just the files, but also the MBR, the master boot record, the volume boot record, all these things that your operating system needs to figure out even how to load or where the offset of your volumes are or all this stuff. And they're not only destroying the active versions of it, but actually the natural backups that the system takes too, so that it's really hard to recover these. And what we've seen them use even more recently is stuff like MBR Killer, or really these different implementations. This one is a completely scripted version of a boot wiper. And the reason they're doing that is essentially if you have the resources to keep rewriting boot wipers over and over again, you're basically telling us this is a really important thing for you. You don't want your disk destroyer to be found, and you're willing to re-implement it 5 different ways. This is obviously something that you're consistently reinvesting in as part of your functionality.
Okay, so now that we've talked about some of the tradecraft associated with APT 38, I think you're starting to see just the massive scale of operations that would be needed to perform these missions. So one thing that sticks out to us about APT 38 is that they were really seamlessly able to conduct multiple intrusions concurrently. And so one fact that sticks out to me is that between November of 2015 and the end of 2016, so not a very long time, they were involved in 9 active compromises against banks. And that number is likely higher, obviously, because we don't have full visibility into additional targets. Adding to the complexity of that operation is the fact that all of those compromises were in different stages of the attack lifecycle. So it really would have involved a massive effort to manage all of those operations simultaneously. Another factor that lends to their scope and scale is the reconnaissance, and we've talked about that before. But that level of reconnaissance involves a lot of people, and it involves a lot of time. And those are two things that we assess APT 38 had. They had the discipline to dedicate those resources, the individuals, and the time. Something that Chris talked about was obviously, their huge bevy of tools, custom, non-public tools that they've created across a variety of functionalities. So we know that they have 26 non-public tools, and they're continuously updating those tools and modifying them, to make them evade detection. Finally, in addition to, the cyber operations that are associated with APT 38, there's a huge human component to these operations. So we know that there were individuals located in country whose job it was to, withdraw these funds and then subsequently launder them. And that involves a huge amount of, effort and manpower. Some of the techniques and tactics that we've learned about that kind of laundering is, there's been public reporting that they would use individuals in country to launder money via casinos and gambling. We also know that, they would transfer funds, as I mentioned, to countries that had little oversight when it came to money laundering. So that made the job even easier. In terms of the actual transfer of funds, they would use a couple of different tactics. They'd set up fraudulent accounts, just completely fictitious. And the second would be that they would actually transfer funds under the guise of a legitimate, government or NGO entity. And in particular, the NGO tactic is something that we've seen a couple of times. It was discussed in public reporting, after a South Asian bank was compromised in 2016, they moved funds to an NGO in Sri Lanka. And we have seen that tactic repeated even recently with an attempted transfer of over $100 million to a South Korean bank for a South Korean NGO. So what is driving our assessment today that this is, North Korean sponsored activity? It's really two pillars of evidence. And a lot of this evidence has been recently illuminated through the DOJ complaint. We base these, this evidence on two facts: ties to North Korean infrastructure and also persona links to North Korean military units. So as I mentioned, the DOJ complaint really brought to light a lot of these infrastructure connections. And specifically, they talked about 2 blocks of IPs that were associated with North Korea that have been used in APT 38 operations. It's probably good to note at this time that, access to internet in North Korea, it's not so easy. So these actions, if they're coming from North Korean infrastructure, the government was likely aware or obviously sponsoring them. And these 2 IP blocks that we're referring to, one is actually leased or registered to a company in China and then leased to North Korea, and the other one is actually registered to a country in North Korea. So we have some validation in addition to the DOJ complaint of this in public reporting. Some other vendors have talked about that North Korean operators, in one instance, they logged into a watering hole domain, which occurred in 2016 from North Korean IP space. We also know that North Korean infrastructure was used in 2 other ways. So what we call infrastructure management and then pre-attack reconnaissance. So for infrastructure management, one thing that's very characteristic of APT 38 and their malware is that they often use dynamic DNS domains. So the complaint actually detailed that a North Korean operator logged in from a North Korean IP address to an account used to manage a dynamic DNS domain. And this domain was associated with a malware that we call Whiteout. We had seen Whiteout used to target a Southeast Asian bank in 2015 and 2016, and we saw that logging in activity occur around October of 2015. Finally, we've seen this pre-attack reconnaissance. So we know that North Korea was conducting reconnaissance on banks that they were potentially interested in targeting. And in one kind of shocking instance, they conducted research from a North Korean IP to a specific bank they were interested in targeting. They looked up their business identifier code, or their BIC code, which is central to SWIFT transactions. And then a short while later, we actually saw APT 38 target that organization.
Yeah, so everyone check their firewall. If you see these IP addresses looking for something, might want to investigate them. I don't know.
So a second pillar of evidence are these persona ties, also that the DOJ complaint really illuminated. So we know the subject of the complaint, Park Jin-hyuk, likely had a malware or operational development, role in an organization. We also know that he supported multiple North Korean operations. We've talked about this a little bit. So he contributed to APT 38 operations, temp permit, and also some additional incidents. Well, the complaint details that Park has specific ties to Lab 110, and Lab 110 is subordinate to the 6th Technical Bureau in North Korea's Reconnaissance Bureau General. We also know that Lab 110 leverages front companies located in northern China, like Chosun Expo, that employed Park for their operations. So finally, going into what are the actions that are driving this activity? So when we took note of the timeline of APT 38 actions, it was really clear that they were influenced by sanctions, and especially the consistent stream of sanctions that we've seen against North Korea since 2013. And those sanctions have really taken aim at both North Korea's access to the international banking community, and they've gotten more restrictive over time, but they've also taken aim at exports. And that has just restrictively caused North Korea to have, lack of access to funds, and it's also emboldened their operations. In particular, these multiple sanctions a year, so in years like 2016 and 2017, they likely influence APT 38's operations and, the number of heists that they were conducting.
We've also seen North Korea's cyber operations mirroring illicit activities elsewhere. So we've seen drug trade as well as smuggling, and recent reports have said defectors have cited cyber military units trying to generate money for the regime.
So what's the future for APT 38? Well, if we know anything about North Korea, it's that they're not going to be deterred, by public outing or likely diplomatic action. So we assess these operations are going to continue. We do believe that they may change tactics, based on their level of, access to currency if that continues to deteriorate. But another thing that's important to think about in terms of new tactics is that over the past couple of years, as these heists are occurring, there's growing awareness in the security community between SWIFT and international banks, that they have to work on security, they have to work together, they have to share indicators. And over the last couple of years, there's really been a number of unsuccessful heists by APT 38. They've attempted funds transfers, and maybe a majority of the money has been returned. So if their operations continue to be, not as successful, we assess they may use new tactics. So before we go into questions, we just want to thank some other business units that were, integral in the success of this project. Chris and Mandy in Consulting, of course, for coming up here today and helping us out. Adversary Practices, our espionage team within iSight, and also FLAIR, which is our FireEye Labs and reverse engineering. So we'll open up the floor for questions.
Great. If you have any questions, please make your way to the mics, and we'll go ahead and start. Sir.
Hey guys, thanks for the great presentation. I had two questions kind of focused around the reconnaissance methods that they were using. Two areas that I wanted to see if you could elaborate more on. You were saying they were using a malware dropper and it was running like NetStat repetitively. If I was collecting like process logs in real time from these systems, would I be seeing these commands being run from a rather oddball process as a possible indicator to be hunting for?
Actually, the process that was running it, they were doing NetStat-like functionality. They weren't actually just running the NetStat tool, but they were doing specifically a process on one of the Swift servers to see who are the people that actually use Swift. So they're trying to figure out who are the people that are connecting to the Swift server. It runs on a specific port, and they wanted to see any connections to there. So they essentially put this tool on there for a short amount of time. I think it was maybe 4 or 5 days, ran it on that system. You would have saw, if you were head monitoring, you would see some strange process that was monitoring connections. And basically, they were just looking for ports and then writing it to a text file. Fortunately for us, they forgot to delete that text file, so we actually ended up using that text file to figure out who the Swift users were so we could know, and then we actually looked on their workstations, and they all had NESTEGG variants on them. So.
Great. And then the second part was involving the scanning of the Windows system. So, and I don't know if scanning's the right term, because normally a group won't do a blind scan in the network. So were they just, I think in my Evelyn Wood speed reading of the report when you guys released it a couple hours ago, were they using the net command to just enumerate the neighborhood and identify the Windows systems rather than doing maybe like a sweep of the IP address range?
Yeah, they were using a whole bunch of different tools that are Linux tools for Windows systems. So they're using things like some really old tools like Medusa and things to actually do like SMB brute force attacks to break into the Windows environment, because by the time they had compromised the Linux systems, they had literally no access into the actual workstations or the users or the Windows servers or Active Directory. They're using other tools too that are specifically Linux tools to interact with Windows over the SMB protocol, over remote desktop, and things like that, and using combinations of those tools to either enumerate Windows systems of interest and also figure out if they had certain vulnerabilities or certain patches were on them and things like that.
Thank you.
Yep.
Great. Did they attempt to recompromise once kicked out of an environment? Were they trying to get back in?
In at least one of the cases I worked on, they shut down the entire network and said, okay, I guess these guys really don't want to come back here. And then a week later, they started trying to come back. And so I thought that was pretty interesting, because maybe they were saying, hey, these guys turn their network back on. But specifically what they were coming back to was that they had left a whole bunch of different backdoors, both on systems that unfortunately were shut down. However, there were a handful of workstations they did not wipe, and we couldn't figure out why they didn't wipe them. Half of the ones they didn't wipe actually had backdoors still on them. So they're hoping that people would just be like, and a lot of those systems are actually the system administrator systems. So system administrators, a lot of them were like, hey, they didn't wipe our systems. However, they had backdoors in them, and that's probably why they didn't wipe those systems. In addition to that, they left backdoors on web servers and other locations, and we saw them keep coming back to those web servers. After we found them, we actually told the attacker, or excuse me, we told the client, hey, turn those web servers off until we can make sure they're patched and they're fully up to date, and then we can bring them back online. And what we saw on their load balancer was the attackers were coming back pretty much every 2 weeks, and then every 3 weeks, and then once a month. And literally, I think they tried to come back like a couple weeks ago when I checked. Just checking for these servers are actually still offline. And what they're hoping is eventually they're going to bring these servers back online. And if they don't know that they implanted those backdoors and those web shells on them, they might still be there. So we see them coming back through a Tor exit node or something pretty much every 2 to 3 weeks, trying to see if they can maybe quickly jump back in the environment.
Excellent. Well, great. We appreciate the unveiling, and it was a great talk.